Hello everyone, today we're going to speak about box 10 of the PI, which includes the terms of delivery. Box 10 presents terms of delivery, which means the scope of responsibilities and liabilities on the buyer's or the seller's side. This is done by entering one of the 11 Incoterms in this box. Each term has a lot of details behind it, which have to be thoroughly considered before we use them. Many years ago, there were no clear definitions of these responsibilities and liabilities, which caused a lot of consequences and confrontations between the business people. So the ICC, International Chamber of Commerce, decided to create a resolution for this problem and finally came up with the first set of rules in 1936. Who is ICC? International Chamber of Commerce is the biggest business organization with over 45 million members from 100 countries in the world. ICC has three main activities. 1. Rule setting. 2. Dispute resolution. 3. Policy advocacy. For more information about ICC, you can refer to their website. Incoterms are revised every 10 years by a group of top business experts in ICC. While using the Incoterms in your contracts, you must mention the revision year in order to prevent any duality in the interpretation of the term. Disclaimer: I'm not a lawyer and lessons given are not legal advice. I'm just sharing my professional knowledge and experience earned over 2 decades. The codes I use from the Incotems2020 book are all the intellectual property of International Chamber of Commerce, whom I thank for their effort and perseverance in updating and revising the terms and also permitting me to use them. Some points about Incoterms. As we said before, the Incoterms define the scope of responsibilities and liabilities of the seller and the buyer. But please note that you must include them in your sales contract, signed and stamped by the buyer and the seller if you want them to be binding. Here we have a brief explanation of Incoterms2020, which are 11 items. Ex Works, delivered at named place ready to be loaded. FCA, delivered at named place ready to be unloaded. FAS, delivered on the wharf or on a barge next to the vessel. FOB, delivered placed on the vessel. CFR, delivered at the port of destination. Unloading cost to be agreed. CIF, delivered in short at the port of destination. Unloading cost to be agreed. CPT, delivered loaded at the region and transported to the named place. CIP, delivered loaded in short at the region and transported to the named place. DAP, delivered ready to be unloaded at the named destination. DPU, delivered unloaded at the named destination. And DDP, delivered released and unloaded at the named destination. Here we have a graphical presentation for better understanding. I have chosen Istanbul in Turkey since this city is divided into 2 parts by the Bosphorus Strait, and we have a unique advantage to explain the terms. The first term is Ex Works, and in this case the seller has the least responsibility and the buyer has the most. In the first step, the seller provides goods packed and ready for loading at its own premises. Then the seller or its representative, which is a forwarder, I think in this case, will pick up the goods and do the local transportation from the seller's premises to the customs. Then they do the custom affairs in the country of origin. Then they load the goods on the vessel and transport them to the country of destination. They do the custom affairs in the country of destination, and after that they deliver them to the buyer's premises. More details about risk of damage, title transfer, insurance, and other things will be said on the specific chapter of each term. The next term is FCA, free carrier. In this term, first the seller does the packing, loading, and the local transport up to the buyer's carrier's place, ready to be unloaded. Then the buyer's carrier unloads the goods from the seller's vehicle. Then the buyer's carrier does the local transport up to the customs in the country of origin. Then the seller does the customs affairs in the country of origin. Then the buyer's carrier loads the goods to the international means of transport. Then the buyer's carrier does the international transport up to the country of destination. Then the buyer does the customs affairs in the country of destination. And finally, the buyer does the local transport in its own country to its own premises. FAS, free alongside ship. This term is a special one mainly used for heavy machinery which need a special handling. In this term, the seller loads the merchandise on the vehicle and does the local transport up to the wharf next to the ship and unloads the goods on the wharf next to the ship ready to be loaded. Then the buyer's carrier loads the merchandise on the vessel. Then the international transport is done by the buyer's carrier. Next, the discharge is done on the buyer's cost and risk in the country of destination. Then the customs affair is done by the buyer, and finally the local transport inside the country of destination is done up to the buyer's premises by itself. FOB, free on board. This term is one of the most famous terms in international trade. Like FAS, it is only used for the ocean transport. The process is like this. The seller packs, loads, and transports the goods to the harbor and to the customs. The seller does the export customs clearance and loads the goods to the vessel. The buyer's contracted carrier or shipping company ships the goods to the country of destination. The buyer clears the goods from customs in its country. And finally, the buyer does the local transport to its own premises. CFR, cost and freight, also frequently used in international business. The process in this term is like this. The seller packs, loads, and transports the goods to the harbor and the customs in the country of origin. The seller does the export formalities in the customs. The seller loads the goods on the vessel. The seller ships the goods on its own cost but on the buyer's risk to the country of destination. The buyer or seller unloads the goods from the vessel in country of destination. The cost of unloading depends on the agreement between the buyer and the seller. Then the buyer clears the goods from the customs in the country of destination, and finally the buyer does the local transport to the final destination. CIF, cost, insurance and freight, totally identical to the CFR, but in this term the seller has to buy insurance for the goods to cover the goods until they are unloaded in the country of destination. CPT, carriage paid to. This is an alternative for CFR when the means of transport is not a vessel or not only a vessel. I mean, when there are more than one kind of transport or one kind of means of transport, which we call it a combined transportation, we also use CPT. CPT is used for all means of transport, including the waterway transport, road transport, rail transport, and air transport. The process is as follows. The seller packs and loads the goods on the truck and transports to the customs. The seller does the export formalities in country of origin. The seller loads the goods on the means of transport for international transport. The seller transports the goods from the country of origin to the country of destination on its own cost but on the buyer's risk. The goods are unloaded in the country of destination on the buyer's or on the seller's cost, depending on the agreement between them. and the buyer clears the goods and transports the goods to the final destination. CIP, carriage insurance paid to. CIP is totally identical to CPT, but the difference is that in CIP, the seller has to buy an insurance to cover the goods from the loading point to the country of destination. This is the only difference between them. DAP, delivered at place. As you can see in this term, the seller has to transport the goods from its own premises to the customs. Then the custom formalities for the export process is on the seller. The seller has to cover those, and then again the seller has to ship the goods from the customs in the country of origin to the country of destination, ready to be unloaded. So unloading in the country of destination is at the buyer's risk and cost. If you just take a look, you will see that there is a high similarity between this term and CFR, and the difference is the responsibility of damage to the goods. In CFR, the responsibility against any damage to the goods transferred to the buyer in the country of origin when the goods were delivered on board. But in DAP, the responsibility of the seller continues to the port of destination. This is the difference between DAP and CFR. DPU, delivered at place unloaded. As you can see, in this term, the seller has to transport the goods to the customs house. It has to cover the customs formalities to export the goods in the country of origin. Then again, the shipment from country of origin to the country of destination is at the seller's cost and risk. The custom formalities in the country of destination is on the buyer, and the taxes will be paid by the buyer. Then again, the delivery from the customs to the final destination in the country of destination is on the seller. Yes, here is DDP, the last term, delivered duty paid. This is the exact opposite point to the Xworks term. As you remember, in Xworks, the seller had the least responsibilities and the buyer had the most, and here is the opposite. I mean, here the seller has the most responsibilities and the buyer has the least. The seller is supposed to do everything from its own premises, from loading the goods on the vehicle until they are delivered to the buyer at its own premises.